They brought her down over the drift corridor, 2 conclave interceptors on her tail, and a hull full of holes she'd been patching with her thumbs for 6 minutes. The crack talon fighter went into a spin somewhere over the cloud shelf, and she rode it all the way down, laughing, because what else was there to do when you were spinning toward your death at 400 meters per second? The interceptors didn't even fire the last volley. They watched her go. They probably thought the fall would do it. Margaret Cohere had survived worse than a fall. She came to in a salvage field, half buried in her own cockpit, the wreckage cooling around her in the thin gray light of early morning. Her lip was split. 3 ribs were either cracked or broken. She couldn't tell which, and it didn't much matter. She lay there for a moment, looking up at the sky, through the hole where her canopy used to be, and she felt the specific stillness that comes after you survive something that should have killed you. Then the conclave retrieval team arrived, and that stillness ended. They processed her in a holding facility on the transit moon. A gray corridor, a gray cell, gray food that she didn't eat. They took her weapons, her boots, the small iron ring she wore on her left thumb that had belonged to her mother. They left her the clothes she'd been wearing when she crashed, which were stiff, with dried blood and hydraulic fluid, and smelled like burning wire. She wore them anyway. She wore them through 3 days of processing and 2 days of transport, and into the courtroom of the 8th adjudication chamber of the outer conclave, where the gallery was full and the air tasted of recycled atmosphere and political theater. The chamber was built for intimidation. She could see that the moment they brought her in, high ceilings, clean white stone, the kind of architecture that says, "We have been here a long time, and you have not." The magistrate's bench sat elevated above the floor on a stepped dais, and behind it sat a man whose face she had never seen before, but whose type she recognized immediately, the kind of man who had never been in a fight he hadn't arranged in advance. Thin, precise, the sort of precise that comes from never having had to improvise. There were spectators in tiered rows above the floor. She didn't look at them. She looked ahead, which meant she was looking at the magistrate. And she did it the way she'd looked at every dangerous thing in her life. Directly, without blinking, without giving anything away. The charges took 11 minutes to read. 27 counts of sedition, 18 counts of inciting insurrection, 9 counts of attacking conclave transport vessels, 1 count of coordinating the assault on the merger ceremony at Freeport Station, where 6 conclave administrators had died, and the signing of the Integration Compact had been delayed by 14 months. She listened to all of it without moving. When the clerk finished, the magistrate looked down at her the way you look at something you've already decided to throw away. "Do you have anything to say in response to these charges?" She had a great many things to say. She said the one that mattered. Every single one of them was necessary. The gallery made a sound. Some variation of shock and outrage, the kind of sound galleries make when they've been given permission to be shocked and outraged. The magistrate raised one hand, and they quieted. "Necessary," he repeated. He let the word sit there between them, stripped of meaning by repetition. "You describe the deaths of 6 conclave administrators as necessary." "I describe the liberation of Salvo as necessary," she said. "The 6 administrators were in the way." The gallery erupted again. The magistrate didn't bother raising his hand this time. He let it run. She stood in it, in the noise and the heat of collective judgment, and she felt nothing except a low, steady anger that she had been carrying for so long it had become part of her weight. "The Integration Compact," the magistrate said when the gallery had settled, "brought Salvo into the protection of the conclave. It brought infrastructure, medical facilities, trade routes. You describe this as occupation. I describe it as what it is, And what you did, the riots, the attacks, the destruction, you described this as liberation. I describe it as what it was. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. Neither of them was trying to convince the other of anything. They both understood this was performance, that the verdict had been decided before she walked through the door, that this entire proceeding existed for the gallery, and for the broadcast, and for the record. She was a symbol. She had always been a symbol. The difference was that the conclave was now trying to use her as their symbol. Cautionary tale, proof of consequence, demonstration of what happened when you fought against the inevitable. She'd spent 20 years refusing to be anyone's symbol but her own. The charges are not in dispute, the magistrate said. Your guilt is not in question. What this chamber is determining is the appropriate disposition of a convicted terrorist. Then, get on with it, she said. He did. He read a sentence that ran to 4 paragraphs of legal language, and at the center of it, buried in subordinate clauses and jurisdictional citations, was the word execution. She heard it the way you hear a thing you've been waiting for. Not with surprise, not with fear, with a kind of grim recognition. Right. Then she looked at the bars in front of her, a low rail of dark metal, the kind of thing installed to keep defendants from rushing the bench, and she bit into it. She bit down hard, the way she'd learned to bite down on pain when she was 9 years old and didn't have anyone to cry to, and she felt something crack in her mouth. Gold. Her back molar, the one she'd had capped after the fight at Breakwater Station. She worried it free with her tongue, worked it to the front of her mouth, and spat it. The tooth hit the magistrate directly in the right eye. He didn't scream. He made a short, sharp sound, not quite human, and clapped his hand over his face. When he pulled it away, there was blood on his palm and he couldn't open the eye, and for one clear, perfect moment, the entire gallery was absolutely silent. She was already smiling. They dragged her out of the chamber with 4 guards on her arms, and she let them drag her because she was still smiling and she wanted to keep smiling for as long as possible, wanted to carry this feeling, this small, exact victory, into whatever came next. What came next was the execution yard. It was a wide, flat space on the lower level of the facility, open to the sky, with walls on 3 sides, and a viewing platform on the 4th. The walls were stained with the kind of marks that don't come out. The ground was dark in patches. She didn't need to look closely to know what the patches were. There were 6 guards, arranged in a line 20 meters away. They had their weapons up, professional, disciplined. The kind of soldiers who were very good at following orders and had never needed to be anything else. The magistrate stood on the viewing platform above them, one eye covered with a field dressing now, reading from a data slate in a flat, formal voice. Final confirmation of identity, final confirmation of sentence, final opportunity for statement. She didn't hear most of it. She was doing something else. She was standing straight, feet apart, the way her people had always stood before the hardest things. She raised her hands, not in surrender, never in surrender, and she began. The haka starts in the body before it reaches the throat. It starts in the bones, in the soles of the feet, in the hands that slap the thighs and the chest. Building heat, building rhythm, building the specific defiance that her people had carried, from one impossible situation to the next across centuries, that the conclave didn't know and couldn't touch. She stamped, she moved, she made her body into a declaration. She had no audience for this. The guards didn't understand it. The magistrate didn't understand it. This wasn't for them. This was for Salvo, for Walter, wherever he was, for her mother and her father and her sister, who had died before she was old enough to know what she would become. For a person from her planet who had been told that what they had was not worth fighting for. Her voice filled the yard. Her feet struck the ground. The guards held their weapons and stared at her, and she looked directly at them, and she did not stop. She did not stop. She was still moving when the order came to hold fire. The voice came from the platform, not the magistrate's voice. Another voice, smoother, the voice of a man accustomed to making pronouncements in rooms that would remember them. She stopped. She turned. There was a second figure on the viewing platform now, standing beside the magistrate, and she couldn't out his face clearly from this distance, but she could read his posture. The easy, unhurried confidence of someone who had just done something that cost him nothing and gained him everything. She didn't know who he was yet. She would learn. The magistrate's voice came back, flat with a new emotion she couldn't quite identify. Resentment, maybe, or the controlled fury of a man who had been outmaneuvered in his own courtroom and couldn't show it. "The sentence of execution is suspended," he said. "By order of the Oversight Committee, the condemned will be remanded to the custody of the Apex Games Directorate." She let the words settle. The Apex Games. She knew what the games were. Everyone knew what the games were. The conclave's great spectacle, broadcast across every inhabited system, competitors killing each other in the arena while billions watched. She despised them for years, had seen them as the clearest expression of what the conclave actually was. A system that turned violence into entertainment and called it sport, that fed its subjects the thrill of bloodshed so they'd never look too hard at the bloodshed being done in their names. Now she was going to be in them. The magistrate was speaking again, and she heard the satisfaction in his voice, now beneath the resentment, the particular pleasure of a man delivering a sentence that was worse than what came before. "You will be entered into the Apex Games not as a competitor of standing, but as a condemned prisoner. You will fight in the arena until you die, for the entertainment of the Outlands. Your fellow competitors will serve as your executioners." He paused for effect, the way she'd seen him pause in the courtroom. "I may be your judge and your jury, but your old friends and your old enemies will be the ones to carry out the sentence." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed. Not a performance, not defiance for its own sake. A real laugh, the kind that comes from deep in the chest. Because she had just understood something that the magistrate hadn't. She laughed until the guards shifted their weight and looked at each other, uncertain, because they had expected tears or rage or pleading, and they did not know what to do with this. The figure on the platform watched her. Even at this distance, she could see that he was not laughing. He was watching her the way you watch something you've purchased and aren't sure yet what use you'll put it to. She didn't care what use he thought he was putting her to. She cared about what she was going to do with herself. She'd been in the games before, not as a competitor, as a spectator reluctantly, years ago when Walter had dragged her to watch someone he wanted her to see fight. She knew the format. She knew the terrain maps, the drop patterns, the weapon caches, the way the directorates staged the fights for maximum broadcast value. She knew the competitors by reputation, the veterans, the ones who'd won multiple times, the ones who fought smart versus the ones who fought hard. She could beat all of them, not because she was better in any technical sense, not because she had some advantage they lacked, because she had already been standing in front of a firing squad this morning, and she was still standing, because she had been trying to die for Salvo for 20 years, and she hadn't managed it yet, which is suggested that dying was a thing she was constitutionally unsuited for, and because the games were broadcast everywhere. The magistrate had framed this as a death sentence. He thought putting her in the arena was a way to dispose of her publicly, to give her death meaning as a symbol of conclave authority, to use her body to send a message about what happened to people who resisted. He hadn't thought it through. She was going to win. She was going to keep winning. She was going to win until the Outlands couldn't look away from her. until her face was on every broadcast and every screen, until everyone who had ever thought about fighting the conclave and hadn't because they were afraid had a reason to stop being afraid. You could not make her into a lesson about the cost of resistance. She would make herself into a lesson about its possibility. This was the thing they never understood. The conclave, the magistrate, the smooth man on the platform who thought he'd bought himself a useful piece on the board. They understood power as something that moved from the top down, something that flowed from authority to subject, from law to body. They did not understand that it could move the other way. They did not understand that a single person, watched by enough people, doing the impossible thing with enough consistency, could become more powerful than any courtroom, any firing squad, any sentence delivered from a raised bench. She had been shot down. She had been processed. She had been tried and sentenced and brought to a yard to die. And she was still here, still standing, still angry in the specific and productive way she'd been angry since she was a child in a dusty corner of a planet that everyone else had written off. The guards came to take her to transfer processing. She let them. She was already thinking ahead, already running scenarios, already planning the first match and the second and the third, already thinking about what she'd say to the broadcast if they gave her a chance to speak, already thinking about salvo and what it would look like to see one of their own winning. On the transport, shackled at the wrists and ankles, surrounded by 4 conclave soldiers who had been told to watch her as if she were dangerous, she looked out the small port window at the stars going by. She thought about her mother, about the sound her mother used to make when she sang. Not a song exactly, more like a low, constant, humming, tuneless in the way of someone who isn't performing, but just making sound because silence is too heavy. She'd forgotten that sound for years. She remembered it now, in the transport, shackled a bench on her way to fight for her life in front of billions of strangers. The memory didn't make her sad. It made her warm, the way a coal is warm. Not burning, but keeping heat, the kind of heat that lasts. She leaned her head back against the hull and closed her eyes. The guards watched her. She breathed slowly and steadily and did not give them anything to watch. Her ribs still hurt. The split in her lip had crusted over. Her thumb felt wrong without the ring, and she would get it back someday. Or she would replace it, or she would find another thing to wear that meant the same thing. She was good at substitution. She was good at finding what mattered and holding it in a different container when the original one broke. She thought about the yard, about the guards standing in a row, about the moment when she'd started the haka and watched their faces change. Not to fear, not quite, but to something adjacent to it. The thing that happens when you encounter something you don't have a framework for, and your certainty cracks. She'd done that with just her body and her voice, with 6 guards and a magistrate and a firing squad between her and the horizon. She'd cracked their certainty with nothing but the oldest thing she owned. Imagine what she was going to do with an arena. The transport docked. The guards stood. Someone outside worked the locks and the door opened on a new facility, clean and bright, smelling of nothing, the specific smell of places designed to smell like nothing, to process people in and out without leaving a mark on them. They were going to mark her. She was going to let them. Processing, identification, gear assignment, briefing. She would go through all of it quietly and carefully, learning the facility, learning the rhythms, learning the faces of the people around her. She had learned early that you saw more when you were still. That stillness looked like submission to people who didn't understand it, and that the gap between what she looked like and what she was had always been one of her better weapons. A directorate official met her at the processing desk. Young, female, Trying hard to look like this was a normal intake and not a situation she found unusual. Maggie respected the effort. Margaret Cohere, the official said, reading from a data slate, convicted on 27 counts, remanded to the games by oversight order. She looked up. Do you understand the terms of your participation? Fight, Maggie said. Don't die. Simple. The official blinked. There are conduct requirements. In the broadcast windows you'll be expected. What I'll be expected to do, Maggie said very quietly, and what I do are usually different things. You'll want to put that in your file. The official stared at her for a moment. Then she wrote something on the slate. Maggie looked past her at the facility, at the corridors and the equipment bays and the other competitors moving in the distance. Some of them watching her, some of them deliberately not watching her, which was its own kind of watching. She had 3 ribs that might be broken. She was wearing clothes that smelled like a crash. She hadn't slept in 4 days. She had been tried in a theater and sentenced to die in a spectacle, and she had laughed at the magistrate who pronounced it, and she would laugh at the next thing and the next thing because the specific quality of her that they could not account for, could not process, could not cancel with a verdict or a firing squad or a sentence delivered from on high, was that she found this funny. Not the dying, not the violence, not the loss of her people's freedom, not the weight of what she'd done and what had been done to her. Those things weren't funny. Those things were the stones she carried and would keep carrying. But this, the conclave putting her in their arena because they couldn't figure out what else to do with her. Their certainty that this was a disposal and not an opportunity. The way the magistrate had looked at her, bloodied and bound, and seen a symbol to extinguish rather than a fighter looking for new terrain. That was funny. She'd been given the outlands. She was going to use them. She walked into processing. She was still smiling.